Get out of my house.
Sir, I'm only here because my son asked me to come.
And you? You don't belong on this floor.
I'll stand by the door then. I won't touch anything.
You'll do more than that. You'll leave.
Excuse me, have you seen Dorothy Coleman?
Ma'am, there's a car pulling up. They're asking for you by name.
Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 2 hours earlier, none of this had happened yet. Dorothy Coleman stood outside the gates of Ashford Manor in Greenwich, Connecticut, holding her purse a little tighter than she needed to. She had worn the same navy dress to 3 funerals and 1 wedding. And tonight she wore it again because it was clean and it was hers, and she had never needed anyone's approval to feel like she belonged somewhere. She was 61 years old. She had raised her son James alone after his father passed, working double shifts at a hospital laundry service for 11 years before anyone gave her a chance to prove she could do more than fold linens. Tonight her son was hosting his in-laws at the biggest party of the Ashford family calendar, and Dorothy had promised him she would come, smile, and stay out of the way. James had married Victoria Ashford 2 years earlier, and from the very first dinner, Richard Ashford, Victoria's father, had made his opinion of the Coleman family clear without ever needing to raise his voice. Richard built his fortune the old-fashioned way, inheriting most of it, and multiplying the rest through decades of ruthless deal-making that left him convinced that money was proof of character. He looked at Dorothy the way he looked at a stain on a white tablecloth, something to be dealt with quietly and quickly so the evening could continue undisturbed. Eleanor, his wife, was gentler in appearance but no kinder underneath, offering compliments that felt more like corrections, the kind of woman who could insult your shoes and your posture in the same sentence without ever raising an eyebrow. The manor itself sprawled across 11 acres of manicured lawn, with a ballroom that could hold 300 people comfortably and tonight held exactly 200, all dressed in the kind of clothing that cost more than Dorothy's monthly rent. String lights lined the hedges. A live band played somewhere near the terrace. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of food that nobody seemed to actually eat, more interested in being seen holding a glass than in what was inside it. Dorothy noticed the small things nobody else did, the exhausted young valet parking cars in the summer heat, the coat-check girl who flinched every time someone raised their voice, the quiet tension among the men in dark suits clustered near the bar who kept checking their watches like they were waiting on something bigger than the party itself. What none of the guests knew, and what Richard Ashford himself did not fully understand yet, was that his company, Ashford Industries, was one signed contract away from collapse. The business had been bleeding money for 3 consecutive quarters, and every executive in that ballroom was quietly praying that a single investor scheduled to arrive that night would agree to save it. Nobody had met this investor in person. Nobody even knew what they looked like. All anyone in that boardroom knew was a name on a letterhead and a reputation for being fair, exacting, and impossible to fool. Someone who had turned 3 failing companies into profitable ones over the last decade, without ever once appearing at a press conference or a photo shoot. Dorothy found James near the edge of the dance floor, his tie already slightly loosened, his shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man who loved his wife and dreaded his father-in-law in equal measure. He hugged her tightly and asked if she was doing all right, the way he always did, like he was still that same boy checking on his mother after a long shift. She told him she was fine, that it was a beautiful party, and that she had no intention of causing any trouble tonight. Victoria joined them a moment later, kissing Dorothy's cheek and thanking her for coming, whispering that her father was already in one of his moods, and it would be best if they all stayed close together for the evening. For the first hour, the party moved exactly the way parties like this always move, full of small talk about vacations and golf memberships, and which private school was accepting new students in the fall. Dorothy drifted along the edges, declining champagne, speaking kindly to the staff, remembering names that most of the guests never bothered to learn. She had spent enough of her life being overlooked to understand exactly how much it meant when someone finally noticed you. And so she made a point of noticing everyone in that room who seemed used to being invisible. None of them had any idea who she truly was, and she preferred it that way. She had built something enormous over the last 15 years, quietly, carefully, without ever needing a stage to prove it. Richard Ashford found her near the fireplace just as the band took a short break, and the moment his eyes landed on her, something in his expression hardened into the particular cruelty of a man who had decided long ago that people without money were beneath his attention. He asked her, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, where exactly her family came from, what exactly she had ever accomplished, and why exactly his daughter's husband had chosen to bring someone like her into his home. Dorothy answered calmly, telling him only that she had worked hard her entire life and had never asked anyone in his family for a single thing. Richard laughed, the kind of laugh designed to invite an audience, and the audience gathered exactly as he intended, drawn by the promise of a spectacle the way people are always drawn toward the sound of someone being humiliated in public. He told the room that he had hired an investigator to look into her background, that there was no estate, no fortune, no history worth mentioning, just a woman who had spent her life folding other people's laundry and somehow believed that qualified her to stand in his ballroom. A few guests laughed nervously. Someone lifted a phone to record. James stepped forward to defend his mother, his voice shaking with a fury he rarely allowed himself to show. And Richard turned on his own son-in-law with a coldness that silenced half the room, telling him to choose right then and there between his mother and everything the Ashford name could offer him. James did not hesitate for even a second, telling his father-in-law plainly that he would always choose his mother, no matter what it cost him. Richard's face went red with anger, and he declared that James was no longer welcome in his family, that he would strip every account, every card, every privilege attached to the Ashford name by morning. Dorothy took her son's arm and turned toward the door, prepared to leave quietly and spare everyone further embarrassment. But before she reached the exit, Eleanor Ashford let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, clutching her bare wrist and announcing to the entire room that her grandmother's diamond bracelet had vanished and that Dorothy had been standing beside her only minutes earlier. The accusation spread through the crowd like something alive, hungry, moving from guest to guest faster than anyone could question it, and Richard seized on it immediately, ordering his head of security to search Dorothy's purse in front of everyone. Dorothy stood perfectly still while a stranger opened her bag and turned it over for 200 people to witness, her tissue, her phone, her house key laid bare on a marble table like evidence in a trial nobody had asked her to attend. There was no bracelet. Eleanor demanded a second search, insisting Dorothy must have hidden it somewhere on her person, and for a long, humiliating moment it seemed as though the entire party had already convicted her before a single fact had been established. Dorothy waited until the room had quieted enough to hear her, and then she said, calmly and without a trace of anger, that the bracelet was sitting exactly where Eleanor had left it, on the side table near the fireplace, set down nearly an hour earlier while she adjusted her earring. Every head in the ballroom turned at once, and there it was, catching the candlelight exactly as Dorothy had described, a circle of diamonds resting untouched on the marble. A heavy silence spread through the crowd, the kind of silence that follows 200 people simultaneously realizing they had all been complicit in something ugly. Richard did not apologize. Men who have spent their entire lives being right rarely know how to admit they were wrong, especially not in front of an audience they had gathered specifically to watch someone else lose. He muttered that the discovery proved nothing, though his voice had already lost the certainty it carried only minutes before, and somewhere behind him, through the tall windows facing the driveway, a pair of headlights swept slowly toward the front steps of the house. A car door closed outside, unhurried and deliberate, and footsteps began crossing the gravel path toward the entrance. Richard, still trying to salvage what remained of his authority in that room, turned back toward Dorothy and told her to use the door like everyone else instead of standing near his windows as though she had somewhere important to be. Dorothy told him quietly that she was waiting for someone. Nobody in that ballroom understood the weight of those words yet. Not Richard, not Eleanor, not even James, who had spent 2 years believing his mother's quiet life was exactly as simple as it appeared. Only Dorothy knew that the investor everyone in that house had spent the entire evening anxiously waiting for had just arrived, and that investor had been standing in that ballroom the entire time, wearing a navy dress and holding her ground against a man who had underestimated her from the moment she walked through his gates. The front doors opened, and the room turned as one toward the sound, expecting a stranger, expecting the powerful figure everyone had built up in their imagination for weeks, someone commanding and unfamiliar. Instead, a young associate from Coleman Capital walked in carrying a leather folder, scanned the crowded ballroom, and asked, in a clear and steady voice that carried across the silence, whether Mrs. Coleman was available, as the final documents for the Ashford Industries agreement were ready for her signature. Every executive near the bar went pale at once. Richard Ashford's champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips. Dorothy Coleman, the woman he had just accused of theft, the woman he had declared unworthy of standing on his marble floors, was the chairwoman of the very firm that held his company's survival in her hands, and she had watched him prove exactly who he was before he ever learned who she was. For a long moment, nobody in that ballroom moved. Richard Ashford stood with his glass still raised halfway to his lips, staring at the young associate from Coleman Capital as though the man had spoken in a language he did not understand. Dorothy Coleman did not rush to explain herself. She did not raise her voice or step forward to enjoy the moment the way another person might have after being humiliated in front of 200 strangers. She simply set down the small clutch that had been searched and emptied only minutes earlier, thanked the associate for his patience, and told him she would join him by the study in a moment, once she finished her conversation with Mr. Ashford. The calm in her voice was somehow louder than anything Richard had shouted all evening. Eleanor Ashford was the first to break the silence, her hand still resting near the diamond bracelet as though she could undo the last 10 minutes simply by touching it. She asked, in a voice much smaller than the one she had used to accuse Dorothy of theft, whether this was some kind of misunderstanding, whether perhaps there were 2 Coleman families, whether surely the woman standing in front of her could not be the same person whose signature every executive in the building had been waiting weeks to secure. Dorothy answered simply that there was only one Coleman family, and that she had spent the last 2 years watching how the Ashfords treated the people they believed had nothing to offer them, which told her everything she needed to know before ever sitting down at a negotiating table. Richard finally found his voice, though it carried none of the certainty it held only minutes earlier. He asked Dorothy why she had never mentioned who she was, why she had allowed him to say the things he said, why she had let him humiliate himself in front of his own guests without once stopping him. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment before answering. She told him that she had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who assumed a modest dress and a quiet voice meant an empty bank account and an empty spine, and that tonight was simply the latest example. She said she had not needed to announce who she was, because his own behavior had already answered every question that mattered about who he was. James stood beside his mother, still absorbing what he had just learned, his mind working backward through 2 years of quiet dinners, modest gifts, and a small apartment his mother always insisted was simply what she preferred, when in truth she had been protecting him from a version of his life that came with strings he had never asked for. Victoria reached for his hand, her own eyes wet, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to pride. Watching the woman who had welcomed her into a family with genuine warmth stand steady in front of the same crowd that had just tried to tear her apart. She whispered an apology to Dorothy on behalf of her parents, though Dorothy gently told her there was nothing for her to apologize for, since she had done nothing but love her husband honestly. The 200 guests who remained scattered through the ballroom began speaking to each other in hushed, uncertain tones, some pulling out their phones again, though this time with far less enthusiasm than before, aware suddenly that whatever they had just filmed painted a very different picture of the evening than the one they had expected to capture. A few of the older guests, the ones who had known Richard for decades, exchanged quiet glances that suggested this was not the first time his temper had gotten ahead of his judgment, only the first time it had cost him quite so publicly. The band, which had paused awkwardly near the terrace, did not resume playing. Nobody asked them to. Richard attempted, one final time, to recover some measure of control over the room, insisting that business was business and had nothing to do with what had happened earlier, that Dorothy would surely be professional enough to separate the two. Dorothy told him plainly that she had built her firm on exactly one principle, that she did not do business with people who treated others as though their worth could be measured by the size of their bank account, and that Ashford Industries would need to find its rescue elsewhere, because she had no intention of signing anything that carried his name on it. The color drained from Richard's face far more completely than it had when he first learned who she was. Walter, the man who ran the company's finances and had stood uncomfortably near the bar all evening, quietly approached Richard afterward, informing him that without the Coleman capital agreement, the layoffs the board had been trying to avoid for months would need to begin within the week, and that several of the smaller creditors were unlikely to extend further patience. Richard did not respond. He simply stood near the fireplace where the confrontation had begun, staring at the same marble table where the bracelet had briefly rested, looking, for the first time that evening, like a man who understood exactly how much his pride had just cost him, and how little of it he could ever get back. Dorothy did not stay to watch the fallout unfold. She had never wanted an audience, not even now, when she finally had every reason to enjoy one. She found James and Victoria near the entrance, told them softly that she was proud of the man James had become and the choice he made without a single second of hesitation, and reminded them both that love should never require anyone's permission or approval, least of all from someone who mistook cruelty for strength. She hugged her son the way she always had, the same embrace she gave him after every long shift and every hard year, and told him that whatever happened next with his in-laws, he would always have a home with her, one built on far steadier ground than marble floors and chandeliers. In the weeks that followed, Ashford Industries scrambled to secure new investors, though word of what had happened at the gala traveled quickly through circles where reputation mattered as much as capital, and few firms were eager to align themselves with a man known now for humiliating a guest in his own home over a bracelet that had never actually gone missing. James and Victoria began building a life increasingly separate from her father's influence, one where Dorothy was not a secret to be managed, but a woman openly celebrated at every family gathering, seated at the head of the table exactly where she belonged. And Dorothy Coleman, the woman who had once folded hospital linens for 11 years to keep her son fed and clothed, continued quietly building the kind of legacy that never needed anyone else's ballroom to prove it was real.